Talk about one of our top stories today, and that surrounds potential changes to same-sex marriage here in the United States and specifically here in Michigan. So the U.S. Supreme Court will decide later this year whether to overturn the constitutional protection for same-sex marriages nationwide. But with new federal protections and a state constitutional ban on same-sex marriage, what would a repeal of that right mean for couples here in our state, here in Michigan? Third on your side, political reporter Josh Albertus verifies.
Talk around same-sex marriage in the United States made new headlines this month after the U.S. Supreme Court was asked to overturn its landmark 2015 ruling in Obergefell v. Hodges that guaranteed same-sex marriage nationwide. The possibility of Obergefell being overturned has had many asking what it would mean for their marriages, especially in a state like Michigan, where the state constitution may conflict with new federal law. So what would a post-Obergefell America mean for same-sex couples in Michigan? Let's verify. Our sources include the Michigan Constitution, the Respect for Marriage Act passed by Congress in 2022, and Tracy Bray, Associate Dean at Cooley Law School. Following a statewide vote in 2004, Michigan's constitution has included a small but consequential clause saying that, quote, the union of one man and one woman in marriage shall be the only agreement recognized as a marriage or similar union for any purpose. So if Obergefell was overturned and the issue sent back to the states, Michigan would not be performing same-sex marriages anymore. But that doesn't necessarily mean people who live here wouldn't be able to have their marriage rights recognized here. That's where federal law comes in.
It does require the U.S. federal government and all U.S. states, right, to recognize the validity of same-sex marriage.
The Respect for Marriage Act was passed by Congress 3 years ago and requires the federal government and all states to recognize the rights of marriages performed where it is legal. So if I lived in Michigan, for example, but got married in a state like New York and came back, Michigan would still have to respect that marriage. But what about pre-existing marriages?
The act is pretty clear, right, that at the federal level and right at the state level, existing marriages should be respected, right, across the 50 states and even into the territories.
When determining if a marriage is valid in a state, the act says only the law of the state at the time the marriage was entered can be considered. It also should be mentioned that the Supreme Court isn't yet guaranteed to hear the case at all. That decision will be made later this year. With your Verify, I'm Josh Albertus.
And Josh joins us now here on the couch. Josh, I think you did an excellent job breaking this down. It's very complex. It's a lot of if this happens, then that could happen. If we don't see this, we may see that. So I really think that was a comprehensive look at this. But you only have so much time to talk about this story during our newscast. What else did you learn today when looking into this topic?
Right. So we kind of already talked a little bit about, the competing factors there and what would be the case if Obergefell was overturned. You have the Respect for Marriage Act on one side, kind of adding some of those protections, not exactly a full codification of Obergefell, right, as it was kind of explained there, but, kind of some of those protections as opposed to the state constitution where if Obergefell were to be overturned, we have a state constitutional ban here in Michigan that says one man and one woman is pretty much the only thing that's going to be recognized here.
Right.
That's currently sleeping because, as we know from the U.S. Constitution, U.S. Constitution, federal laws supersede the state constitution and state laws in many cases. So that is sleeping right now, but it's layers to that as well. It's not just a constitutional ban that we have here in Michigan right now. It's also on the books in law. It's also a statutory ban that was passed in 1996, about 8 years before that constitutional ban was put in place. So we have layers here that would prohibit same-sex marriage from being performed here if Obergefell was no longer there. And kind of what you hear is it was a patchwork before Obergefell, and it might kind of go back to being that way if Obergefell was overturned. Obviously, you would have the chance, like we explained in that story, to go somewhere else like New York or somewhere where it would still be recognized,
right,
come back and have that recognized because you got it lawfully done in another state where you can do it. But, kind of what you hear from some people is, that's just a burden, that's a financial burden, a logistical burden that wouldn't be on heterosexual couples like it would be on same-sex couples.
Sure.
So, there's still, a lot of people are still making an argument as to that. But, that's kind of where we would stand. It's layers upon layers there as to what would and what wouldn't be allowed when it comes to if the states were able to decide all of this.
And of course, this is a very upsetting situation for many here in our community, whether you are a part of the LGBT plus community or not, an ally in some aspect. What's the timeline we're looking at here as far as, when we will know about, what is going to happen moving forward?
Yeah, so it would be expected. And as we mentioned there, it's important to mention again, the justices have not decided whether or not to even take up this case that was requesting that they in part reverse Obergefell. It's expected that they'll make that decision probably in the fall, whether or not to even take up the case. They would then, if that happened, they would then hear it, and then it would be one of those, probably those major decisions that we see come out at the very end of a judicial term, like next June or something, would probably be what people would expect in terms of a final decision if they decided to take up the case and if they decided to put the consideration of whether or not to reverse Obergefell into their decision. So probably about little less than a year if all of those things did line up and we had all of those decisions made in tandem. That would probably be the timeline.
Which we know that can always change too, but we're looking at a pretty, lengthy timeline. This isn't something we'll have an answer to by the end of this week. As far as that piece you mentioned about even hearing the case, what happens if they don't choose to even hear the case in the first place? What does that look like?
Essentially, from what we've heard from legal, or from what our colleagues have heard from legal experts, essentially that's the end of it. Supreme Court is the law of the land. It is the highest court in the land. So if they decide not to take any given appeal or any given case, you can't go any higher.
Right.
The lower court ruling would essentially stand. They wouldn't be taking a stand on whether or not yes or no, but they would. There wouldn't be another level of appeal.
Just saying we're not taking it on at all.
They wouldn't be taking it on, because I think that's important to mention too. We hear all the time, the Supreme Court gets asked to take up tons and tons of cases every single year, and they only choose a few.
Right.
They're not choosing every single one.
They can't hear every case.
Right. They get asked a lot, but they don't choose it all, so it's still to be determined.
And again, you mentioned this timeline is so lengthy, but we are obviously we're waiting to see what could happen, even if we're going to be waiting a long time. What's the response, if any, that you've heard so far just from people here in the state of Michigan, just about reaction to knowing that this could be, in jeopardy, same-sex marriage could be in jeopardy?
Well, certainly a lot of questions. That's kind of what brought on the story today, was all of the questions I heard about, what exactly that means, what that would look like in our legal aspect, in our legal landscape here in Michigan. But, there's also been, even before this news particularly came out, even towards the beginning of the year, where we're seeing movement in response to the prospect that Obergefell could be overturned. When Roe v. Wade was overturned a few years ago, that had a lot of people considering what that meant for other decisions like the same-sex marriage decision that were decided on a similar basis of constitutionality that Roe was, and what that was going to mean. Were we going to see a chance or a push to overturn same-sex marriage? So even earlier this year, I talked to a state legislator who was already introducing legislation to put this to the voters when it comes to our essentially when it comes to our ban and what we would have here in Michigan and that 2004 ban. He was essentially explaining to me the two main different ways that if voters wanted to have a say in this, if Obergefell was overturned and we have that constitutional ban on the books, what would voters say about this? There's essentially two big ways to do that. One would be what he was trying, and introducing legislation through the legislative pathway. You would need 2/3 of lawmakers in both the state House and the state Senate to say, we want to put this to the voters. On a lot of issues, good luck doing that with a current divided government.
Right.
It's very divided right now. So he even kind of acknowledged, that's probably not a likely
chance.
Yeah. Right. But then the other one is a petition drive, kind of what you saw in the absence of Roe v. Wade when that was overturned, and what Michiganders did here in the 2022 election. You would need a few 100,000 signatures from our calculations to get that on the ballot. Either way, both of those ways, if successful, would put it to a statewide vote. Then statewide voters would decide on whatever you were asking them, whether it was a repeal of the 2004 ban or whether it was just a simple, codification. Same-sex marriage is valid here, and that's in our Constitution. Both of those ways would be put to the voters. And from what the legal expert I talked to today was kind of explaining to me, she kind of signaled she expected probably, if this all panned out like this, we would probably see something like that in a similar way to what we saw when Roe v. Wade was overturned a few years ago.
Right. Okay, well, we know that at this point, we're still very much kind of in the preview mode of what we could potentially see happen, at least late this year, next year. So it's, we're really talking about this story very early on. And of course, this is a complicated issue. You do an excellent job explaining it. But if you'd like to see Josh's story again, to sort of understand exactly what all of these layers are that we're talking about, all of the different options and potentials, that will be up on our website in just a few minutes. Josh, thanks so much for walking us through this. We appreciate it, as always.